Okay. Well, I was looking through a travel tour book the other day, and I came upon some bit of trivia that I thought was kind of interesting. In the state of Nevada, there are two extremes in altitude, and they're very close to each other. At one point, the Colorado River, which runs along there in Nevada, on the one side there, is only 240 feet above sea level. That's even lower than we are here in Wisconsin. What are we at, about 500 or 800 feet? Anybody know? 800 to 900? Here, yeah, okay. Well, so 240 feet above sea level is even quite a bit lower than we are here. And then just a little bit away from that, there's Mount Wheeler, or Wheeler Peak, and it's 13,000 feet. Two extremes, very close together. Well, the same is true of these two men in the gospel today. They both went up to pray. They were so close to each other because they were both in that temple, and yet they were so far apart because they came with totally different attitudes and with a totally different approach. So as we look at this story and at these two people, I think Jesus' intent in telling about these two men was for us to ask ourselves, which one of these two people am I most like? Am I trying to make it through life on my own? Am I someone who thinks, well, yeah, I'm a little better than the rest of the people who are here today? Am I trying to determine my own self-worth? Or do I recognize the futility in trying to make it on my own, surrendering to God because of that, begging Him to rescue me from my own messy life and how I mess things up in my life? Well, there's a sense in which I guess we all like to be, or are like a teenager who doesn't want any advice or direction from his or her parents. And most parents try to give advice anyway, and sometimes we're kind of like the kid who covers his or her ears and goes la 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 while the parent is giving some very valuable advice. Well, like the kid who covers his ears, we may be here physically, but not really hearing the good news that Jesus brings, that we don't need to rely on ourselves. We don't need to try to be good people by ourselves. But Jesus gives us a new status that in and of itself is pretty much what we would like to have be anyway, covering us with His forgiveness and making us new people. Let's go back to the story of the gospel for today. The Pharisee was praying first, and before he even opened his mouth, there's this air of superiority. You know, he just looked stuck up. And he prayed first, the Pharisee did. Before he even opened his mouth, he could just see this air of superiority. And so he started, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. Then he went on with a list of what he viewed as his good, self-made qualities that he thought made him better than some other people. He even seems to think that God did this for him, even though he was a heavy participant himself, maybe the major participant. Well, we're not that overt about it, most of us anyway. We don't come here with that kind of sense of superiority. We've heard this parable too many times that we know that we really shouldn't be coming like that. And so we try not to fall into the trap of telling God how great we are and how much better we think that we are than other people. Or do we? So instead of congratulating ourselves, we come at it in a little different way. And it's really much the same thing. It's really congratulating ourselves. We have a tendency to kind of criticize other people. And in one sense, we may be right in assessing that these other people have flaws that maybe we don't see in ourselves. All of us are full of flaws. And you can see more of the flaws in some people than you can see in others. Others of us are very good at covering them up. But most of the time when we're critical of other people, we're doing the same thing as the Pharisee. We're kind of saying to ourselves and to people whom we tell what we think about the other person that we're better than that. And we at least don't do what they do. The other man in the parable today was this tax collector. And the tax collector came with a tremendous feeling of unworthiness. Something must have happened to him that made him come to his senses and that really helped him to see what he was doing and how he was cheating people. So as we see him in the temple full of remorse, we see how ashamed he is of himself and how he's acknowledging that he was crooked. Tax collectors would collect taxes for the Roman government, and the tax collectors were very unpopular in Jesus' day. They were despised for several reasons. First of all, they were employed by the Roman government, and they didn't like this occupation of the Roman government. And then the Roman government would tell them how much tax they ought to be getting from each person, and then the tax collector was free to assess something above that, and that's how he made his income. And so, of course, they were going to push that as far as they could. And in a way, they were kind of like, you know, the mafia when they would sell these insurance schemes to people in the neighborhood so that they wouldn't get, trashed at their places of business and their homes wouldn't get trashed. And so the tax collector, in effect, was saying, you want me to say good things about you to the Roman government? Pay up. And so they did. So he was not liked. Well, anyway, this particular tax collector came because he realized for some reason that his was not an honest profession and that he really had bilked a lot of people very unfairly. He realized how deeply flawed he was, what a mess he made of his reputation, to say nothing about what a mess he made out of his own life. We don't really know what he was doing personally. But anyway, so when he prayed, he had the opposite attitude that the Pharisee had. In his prayer, he called attention to his sins and not to his accomplishments. He was praying, opening himself up to God, trusting in God and not just in himself. Actually, you know, the tax collector had a gift. He had the gift of inadequacy. Think about that for a minute. The gift of inadequacy. It's easy to forget about God and God's way when everything is going our way. That's why inadequacy becomes a gift. When you approach God out of a sense of inadequacy, then God can teach you how to pray. When you approach God out of a sense of inadequacy, then God can teach you how to relate with other people and forgive other people. And when you approach God out of a sense of inadequacy, then the Lord can teach us how to approach our work. When you approach God out of a sense of inadequacy, God can teach us how to live life His way. So a sense of inadequacy turns us to God, or it can. We help others both inside and outside the church when we're willing to confess our inadequacy, because it just changes our attitude toward other people. In a novel called Father Melancholy's Daughter, there's a story about a college professor. His name is Trevor Lafarge, and he's fallen into some kind of disgrace. He did something that really was messing up his life, and he was forced to retire from his position in the school, and he also had to resign from the church council. I don't know what it was that he did, but the professor kept coming to church every Sunday, and he kept going to communion. And so in a sense, he looked and acted the same as he always had. Well, during the first coffee hour after he was banished from his job and also from the church council, a member of the congregation, Miriam Stacy, sidled up to the council president, and she said to him, "I was frankly surprised to see who you know who at the communion table this morning." And the church council president gave Miriam kind of a strange look, and he said, "He better be here. We need some sinners in this congregation. We need him." And so Miriam said, "I beg your pardon?" And so the church council president said, "I said we need him." And he said it in a loud enough voice so that everybody else around could overhear him. "I say we are lucky to have him. This church has to have a few sinners." And then the council president quoted this scripture, "I have not come to save the righteous." And he looked at Miriam and he said, "You know who said that." Jesus concluded his parable with these words about the tax collector. "I tell you, this man," the tax collector, "went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted." Well, that tells us two things, I think. First of all, the tax collector was justified. He was forgiven. Jesus covered his sin and his dishonesty with his righteousness. But not the good Pharisee. We don't hear anything about that, about the good Pharisee. And the second thing that the verse tells us is that God reverses rewards for the humble and the proud. Well, then comes the question, how does God forgive someone like that crooked tax collector who should be punished? And how can he forgive you and me? War has been raging in Syria now for 5.5 years. Can you believe that? We've been hearing this on the news for 5 years. Thousands of people have been killed. Civilians, I'm thinking of especially, including a staggering number of children. Thousands more Syrians have fled Syria because of fearing their lives. Lately, we've heard some more in the news about a group of people called the White Helmets. And they're ordinary Syrians who have emerged from the dust that hangs over cities like Aleppo, and they've gone to some of the most dangerous places on earth in Syria for the sole purpose of saving and rescuing civilian lives in Syria. A couple of weeks ago, we saw on the evening news one of those White Helmets, Khaled Omar, retrieving a 10-day-old baby from the rubble of the house that this baby was living in with his mother, still alive after hours underneath all of this rubble. A year later, and that's when we saw the story, was a year after this rescue happened, the White Helmet Omar was killed by a mortar. And there have been so many other White Helmets, as they've been called, who have also risked their lives and lost their lives saving other people in Syria, civilians I'm talking about, saving them from the horrors of war. Omar and all the White Helmets, who are probably Muslim, are a living parable of how Jesus can forgive someone like the tax collector, because Jesus doesn't look at who a person is or maybe what they have done. Just like these White Helmets don't look at people to see what they like in real life. Are they worth saving? Jesus is the White Helmet of his day and our day, who gave his life so that we could live and be forgiven and not fall into condemnation or even having to doubt whether we make it with Jesus or not. There are a lot more stories about White Helmets saving civilians in Syria, risking their lives and often losing their lives. Another example was on the news last week, where several of these White Helmets saved a man who was trapped under the rubble for quite a few days, and the guy walked away with just a twisted ankle. But the help came from the outside. That was the point of the story. The man could not save himself. He was powerless to do that. In the same way, those who believe in Jesus and his forgiveness are rescued from all that separates us from God, otherwise known as sin. Jesus gave his life to save us from guilt, to cover us with his mantle of forgiveness, and to pull us away from the rubble of our lives that we often so mess up. There is a sense in which the church is a hospital. It's a hospital for sinners. And Jesus is the guy in the white helmet. And he died so that no matter what we have done to screw things up or screw up our lives, we are forgiven if we believe in what he has done. It's as simple and as straightforward as that. None of us should be intimidated by the apparent saintly among us, the stuck-up Pharisee types, you know. None of us should be intimidated by people among us who appear to have everything together and look like they have made it, whatever it is. Instead, focus on your inadequacy and give thanks to God for the gift of inadequacy, because it's in our inadequacy that will then turn us to God. That should be why we come to worship every Sunday, not to trumpet our accomplishments or our good points, but to confess our inadequacy and the need for the white helmet saving power of Jesus, and to praise God for that saving power which we could receive so easily. Jesus tells us we can be rescued from our own guilt and from our feelings of inadequacy. He will rescue us. He's the guy in our lives who can pull us from the rubble of life around us. And we need weekly assurance of that. A tax collector showed up at the temple one day. His prayer was simple and to the point. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. It's a good prayer for each one of us as we enter this temple, this church. God be with you this week.